All right, imagine for a second you're running a huge company. A global crisis just explodes, and all of a sudden, a chunk of your business is smack in the middle of a geopolitical firestorm. Your investors are understandably freaking out. So your first instinct is to be open, right? To be transparent. But what if that very transparency came with a hidden and really steep price? And look, this isn't just some academic thought experiment. As Jamie Dimon, the CEO of JP Chase puts it, geopolitics is the world's biggest risk. This is a real-world, high-stakes game that can create or destroy fortunes, and it is absolutely top of mind for CEOs and investors everywhere. So that brings us to this really fascinating question. When a crisis, like a war, breaks out, common sense says that companies being upfront about their risks is a good thing. But what if that's completely wrong? What if in the middle of all that chaos, being transparent actually gets you punished? To get to the bottom of this, a group of researchers dug into the market's reaction to the Russo-Ukrainian war. And what they uncovered was a genuine and, honestly, a pretty shocking paradox of transparency. Okay, so before the full-scale invasion in 2022, you basically had two types of international companies with ties to Russia. In one corner, you had the transparent firms. These were the ones who were open about their Russian revenues right in their reports. And in the other corner, you had companies whose Russian ties were way harder to spot. You'd have to do some serious digging, like going through the Russian tax register to even know they were there.
Now, here's where it gets weird. When the invasion happened, the stock market, of course, reacted. But not how you'd think. It was the transparent companies, the ones who had been upfront the whole time, that saw their stock prices get hammered the most. The less transparent firms? Yeah, they got hit, but not nearly as hard. So the billion-dollar question is, why on earth would the market punish the honest ones?
To solve this mystery, we first have to understand what investors were doing while this crisis was brewing. So let's rewind the clock to the months leading up to the invasion. Researchers call this the threat phase. It was this period of intense uncertainty where everybody knew something bad could happen, but nobody knew exactly when or what it would look like. And you can really see it on this timeline. Tension started ramping up way back in March 2021 with that first troop buildup. By November, you had public warnings about more than 100,000 troops massing at the border. So the threat was very real, and it was growing for a long time before the invasion in February 2022. And through this whole period, what do you think investors were doing? They were scrambling. They were frantically trying to figure out which of their investments were exposed, hunting for any clue, any little piece of information that could tell them which companies had business in Russia or Ukraine.
And we can actually see this hunt in the data. I mean, look at this chart. It shows a massive, and I mean massive, spike in searches for the word Russia in official company filings on the SEC's database. The demand for information just went completely through the roof.
So investors are screaming for information. You'd think companies would rush to provide it, right? Well, that brings us to the next clue in our mystery. They did the exact opposite. And this is where it gets really strange. At the exact moment investors were most desperate for information, companies with known Russian ties went silent. They just stopped talking about it. Why would they do that? Well, the answer lies in something researchers call the geopolitical cost hypothesis. And the idea is actually pretty simple. Managers basically did the math and figured out that the costs of being visible, facing sanctions, consumer boycotts, intense political heat, were way, way higher than any benefit of being transparent, which is safer to lay low and stay quiet. And we have proof they were actively hiding bad news. Researchers found a sharp spike in something called residual short interest. Now, I know it's a technical term, but just think of it as a way to measure when professional traders are betting against a stock because they have negative information that isn't public yet. And this chart shows it crystal clear. During that threat phase, the residual short interest for companies with Russian operations shot way up compared to other firms. The smart money in the market knew bad news was being held back, and they were placing their bets on it. But that silence couldn't last forever. The second that threat became a reality, the whole corporate strategy had to flip on a dime. On February 24th, 2022, the invasion began. The risk was no longer just a threat. It was real. And in that moment, the corporate silence shattered. The disclosure floodgates finally burst open. But the information didn't just pour out randomly. Oh no, it was highly strategic. Companies that had a lot of short-term, transient investors, they fired off these quick, easy-to-read written reports. But the firms with more stable, long-term investors, they held detailed conference calls where they could give more context and nuance. They were tailoring the message for their specific audience. Okay, so now we have all the pieces of the puzzle. Investors hunting for information, companies strategically going quiet, and then this sudden flood of calculated disclosures. So now we can finally go back and solve our original mystery. Why were the most transparent firms punished the most? The answer comes down to a single, really powerful psychological concept: salience. Salience just means that things that are more visible, the things that are right in your face, they just feel more important and more risky. It's kind of like seeing a big, wet paint sign. Your immediate reaction is to stay away, right? You don't stop to check if the paint is just a little tacky or completely dry. The sign itself, the visible risk, is what makes you change your behavior. And this is the absolute kicker. When all the dust settled and the actual financial reports came out, the salient firms, the transparent ones, ended up reporting about 86% lower actual losses than the less transparent companies. The market punished them more, even though their underlying businesses were fundamentally less damaged. Investors reacted to the big, bright, wet paint sign, not the actual wetness of the paint. It's wild. So, what are the big takeaways from all this? First, when a crisis hits, the hunt for information becomes a frenzy. Second, companies might actually go quiet because they fear the geopolitical cost of being too visible. Third, and this is the big one, markets don't just punish actual risk, they punish salient risk, the risk that's easiest to see. And that all leads to the final point. Sometimes transparency really does have a price. And that leaves all of us with a really tough question for the future. If being transparent can get your company punished by a panicked market in the short term, how should leaders balance that duty to be open with the powerful instinct to just stay quiet during the next global crisis? It's a massive trade-off, and there is no easy answer.